I rise in support of the Veterans Affairs Legislation Amendment Miscellaneous Measures Bill of 2023. And I do so noting that this bill is uncontroversial, but I never miss an opportunity to jump up when I can and speak about veterans and veterans' welfare. The Sunshine Coast, of which I am one of the proud federal members for, has one of the largest veterans populations in the country. And why wouldn't you retire to the Sunshine Coast? Why wouldn't you want to start a new life after your discharge from the military than be on the Sunshine Coast? So who could blame them for that? I want to send a huge shout out to the various ex-service organisations that do such fantastic work in my electorate in particular. We've obviously got the Caloundra RSL sub-branch, we've got the Kuana Waters RSL sub-branch, the Malani RSL sub-branch, the Glasshouse RSL sub-branch. We have great organisations like SMEAC, who I've had quite a bit to deal with recently. SMEAC are trying to develop a Veterans Wellbeing Centre on the Sunshine Coast, and if I get a chance, I'll come back and talk a little bit about the Veterans Wellbeing Centres shortly, now that the Minister has just walked in the room. We have organisations like Wandering Warriors and Soldier On and Young Veterans. There are and many more, no doubt. Diggers Rest, for example. When you join the military because you want to serve your country and you want to serve your fellow Australians. And that life of service doesn't stop when you eventually pull off that uniform and don't put it back on again. That sense of pride, that sense of service to your country follows on, and that's very clear from the explosion, if I can use that term, of ESOs that we have in this country. Now, I congratulate all the many men and women who are involved in the ESOs, but I know, and I'm keen to hear what the Minister says about this, it makes it very difficult for governments of either persuasion when they are dealing with so many different ESOs. So if you're sitting at home right now and thinking, I've got a really good idea, I want to work or provide services or provide a service to a particular cohort of veterans, my plea to you is, rather than start a new charity, rather than start a new foundation, try and find one that is already existing, because there is only so much money at the end of the day that governments are able to provide, albeit very, very significant sums of money. When the Coalition was last in government, we spent $11.5 billion a year on our veterans through the Department of Veterans Affairs. So it is a lot of money, and it becomes very, very difficult for governments of the day to provide those sort of services when they are dealing with so many different ex-service organisations. I want to give a big shout out to all of the executive holders on all the various organisations that serve veterans on the Sunshine Coast. Thank you for your continued service to your friends and comrades. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's a couple of other things I want to take this opportunity, particularly whilst the Minister is here, and that is I want to talk about the GI Bill. This is something that I've been fighting for since I came into this place, and admittedly I have been unsuccessful to date, but that doesn't mean that I will sit down. I think that we have an obligation in this place to further our veterans' education whilst they are still in the services and afterwards. The GI Bill, and you know, clearly we won't call it the GI Bill because the GI is an American term, but if the minister's interested, I've got some suggestions like the Digger Bill or something like that. But the GI Bill emanates from the United States post-World War II, where servicemen, because that's what they were in World War II, servicemen were provided the opportunity to undertake tertiary education on Uncle Sam's tick once they discharged, once they had served, once they had deployed on active duty in World War II. Now, this is a policy which I think we should pick up in this place. We know that many veterans, when they are actually serving, they are flying, they are sailing, they are driving multi-million dollar, sometimes multi-billion dollar equipment. They are someone. They have purpose. They have a sense of mission. They belong to a tribe. And when they discharge, many of them struggle with the loss of all of those things. And whilst the ADF has made some inroads into recognition of prior learning through being a registered training organisation with what they learn, whilst they're in the services, many of them struggle to have those qualifications recognised in the civilian world. And it is so important for men and women, no matter whether you're in the services or not, to feel like you are contributing to your society, but particularly for men and women who have served, who have contributed to their nation. When they lose that sense of purpose afterwards, we have an obligation as governments to ensure that we equip them in the best way that we can to retrain, reskill, remissionise, to help them reintegrate back into civilian life. Now, it's very different, I accept, but my life has some analogies in that I was able to retrain and retribalise when I left the construction sector as a carpenter and joiner and I became a lawyer. I had 4 years that I had to study as a mature age with 3 kids running around the place, but I was fortunate and I was in a position to be able to do that. Many of our veterans aren't. And I think that we really, Minister, we really need to have a close look at a Digger Bill. Yes, it will cost a lot of money, but this is an opportunity for us. You know, we know that the Suicide Royal Commission is undertaking its work as we speak. One suicide is too much. I think of the many veterans and families that I've dealt with, and I have to say, to his credit, I was very worried about a particular constituent of mine. He was getting the runaround from DVA. I rang the Minister, and it was the issue was resolved inside of 24 hours. So I thank you for your willingness to take that call. And, you know, it has to be said that I have had similar experiences with the previous Veterans Affairs ministers where I have equally picked up the phone and said, we have got a problem here, and if we don't fix it, I'm very concerned about this person's welfare. So it's not a partisan thing. I think that the people who sit in your seat, in your particular role, it requires a particular type of individual. I think, if I may be so bold as to say, I think not you are being shortchanged, but the veterans are being shortchanged by you not being in Cabinet. I think you should be in Cabinet. The role is so important that you need to be sitting around the Cabinet table where the decisions are made. $11.5 billion is a lot of coin to be handing out. and those decisions need to be made at the Cabinet table. I think you should be there. I want to also send a big shout out to the Thompson Institute. The Thompson Institute is an organisation, it's attached to the University of the Sunshine Coast, UniSC it's now called. When we were in government, we provided $8 million for the building of Australia's first PTSD centre at the Thompson Institute on the Sunshine Coast. The first PTSD centre, like the first residential eating disorder facility on the Sunshine Coast. But this is an institute, the Brain and Mind Research Centre, which will be looking and researching into PTSD for veterans and emergency service workers. This is a tremendous opportunity for the Sunshine Coast to be able to provide services to veterans and first responders and veteran first responders who struggle with life as a result of what they have dealt with in their careers. And we as civilians will never know or really comprehend the sort of carnage that particularly veterans that will have experienced in conflict, the sort of carnage that our emergency service workers see on a daily basis. And I was speaking with Helen Bartlett, who is the Vice-Chancellor of the UniSC, Helen, just last night about the Thompson Institute and its future, and I'm very pleased to hear that its future is bright. I want to thank Professor Jim Lagopoulos for his service as the Director of the Thompson Institute since it started. Jim has recently departed from the TI, from Thompson Institute. Jim, thank you for your leadership, thank you for your service, thank you for what you did and are doing, continuing to do for veterans and for people who are struggling from poor mental health. Of course, today we recognise, as we previously just held a service at Parliament House recognising 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is, as many of us would know, is a war that really Australians, it was not our crowning glory in how we treated our veterans. Many of our veterans were exposed to despicable, disgraceful conduct from people when they returned from Vietnam, spat on, called baby killers. These are men and women who served this country with distinction, and they deserve our respect. Many of them went under NASHO, under the National Service. They didn't choose to go. They were required to go. And you know, it's very, very difficult for these men and women who have served in conflict. The experiences that they endured, most civilians would have absolutely no comprehension. I also want to give a bit of a shout out to the men from Rifle Company Butterworth, and it's good for the Minister to be here for this discussion. I've been working closely with Graham Mickelberg, who is a retired colonel of the Australian Army, an ex-Rifle Company Butterworth veteran. These are men who they're not looking for anything other than recognition for their warlike service. These are men that went to Malaysia under difficult conditions. I know it's an issue that is being currently investigated by an inquiry, thanks to Andrew Gee, the previous minister. But, Minister, I would encourage you to look closely at that inquiry, that report, when it gets handed down, and to give it your full consideration.